The year was 2014, the same year that I graduated from high school in a small rural town. My small group of friends were planning to take a week-long senior trip to the Big Apple, which would be entirely funded by this college advancement program we were all enrolled in. Awesome, right? Well, yes, but in the same breath, a resounding no. I should have died on this trip on multiple occasions due to my complete disregard of stranger danger, but I'm only going to tell you one instance I had on this trip, to keep it as short as possible. To put it plainly, my friend and I were almost trafficked by two men, but somehow we survived. Let's just jump right into it, as the great Philly D once said. I would also like to provide a bit more context. I mentioned our senior trip being funded by a college program to infer that there were chaperones present during our trip, but seeing as my friends and I don't listen to authority very well, like every other freshly graduated high schooler, the chaperones are practically non-existent in this story. In fact, it starts with my two closest friends, we'll call them Leo and Courtney, and I taking the wrong subway purposely to lose our chaperone and the rest of the group. Mind you, we did this frequently and never got in trouble before. But we didn't want to go back to our shabby hotel in the Bronx. We were going to check out the nightlife in Times Square, all on our own. While parading through the street performers on the strip, Courtney and I are suddenly stopped by two gentlemen. Things are a little fuzzy from here, but I'm not exactly sure how these two men started up a conversation in the first place. Luckily, Leo, the only male in our entourage, intervened and slid into the conversation with us and our newfound acquaintances. Looking back, I wonder if Leo was the only deterrence that stopped these two men from nabbing both me and Courtney right then off the street. Like I said, it was a while ago, and the conversations we had are blurry at best, but I do remember how the two men looked and presented themselves. They both seemed like they were around the same age, possibly a little older, and were both extremely polite and welcoming. The two men were also very generous and offered all three of us a beer from multiple six-packs they were carrying in public. May I remind you, we were clearly underage, and the legal drinking age is 21 years old in the US if you weren't aware. Obviously, the legality of the situation was not a top priority, and the five of us began walking away from the populated Times Square into the more desolate streets. As we walked down the eerily quiet streets of Manhattan together during the wee hours of the morning, we threw back the six-packs like nobody's business, without a care in the world. This is when things get even more blurred, and my intuition started to kick in, thankfully. I felt much more intoxicated than I normally would after consuming just a few beers, and I knew it was time to stop. I yeeted my partially half-full beer bottle into the water as we crossed a monumental bridge on foot. Things are only going to escalate from here. I remember the men inviting only Courtney and I to a pool party back at their fancy hotel. I found it incredibly rude they didn't invite Leo as well. I don't remember if Leo was even aware of the invitation at the time, but I do remember him grabbing my arm and Courtney's at the best moment possible. By this point, we had walked literally 20 blocks away from Times Square, and before Leo had grabbed me away, I was walking into what seemed like an abandoned hotel with no electricity. Leo ran down the block with me and Courtney hand in hand, as the two men we had just met called out to us. I can vaguely remember them telling us to wait there, and they would call a taxi for us, but Leo continued booking it down the street and around the corner to safety. Once we rounded the corner and ran into a 24/7 convenience store, Courtney began sinking to her knees and collapsed right in the middle of the store. She had finished her beer, unlike me, and it was obvious then that they were laced with something. Both Leo and I scooped up our inebriated friend before the store clerk saw what was going on. I looked up the phone number for a nearby taxi service to get us back to our shabby hotel. The last memory I had that night was lifting Courtney's limp body into the back of a taxi while the driver stared at us inquisitively. Great memories, those. All three of us thankfully made it back to our group at the hotel unharmed. Hell, the coordinators didn't even have the slightest clue what had occurred. They were under the impression that we must have gotten turned around at the subway station, but would find the way back easily. As aforementioned, we had done the whole disappearing act in the subway on multiple occasions during our trip. But let's get back to the two guys we met that night. I'm not going to give away any identifying information on the duo, but I did do my own research after, and found that the two were actually brothers who ran a large prostitution ring a state over. The brothers were tried on multiple heinous felonies and found guilty on some, but not all counts. Hey, at least they're both behind bars now for a long time, though. A few years back, my then boyfriend and I, 22 and female at the time, were living in a one-bedroom apartment in downtown Denver, about a mile away from the coveted Larimer Square and tourist favorite 16th Street. The location was fantastic, but of course, with people-dense areas often comes trouble. We lived in a historic house, with 4 townhouses right next to each other. The layout is important to the story. All 4 front doors were aligned on a single porch. My apartment was located right next to an alley, and was the last door on the left. Due to a work obligation, my boyfriend was sent on a 3-month-long work assignment, leaving me alone in the house with our 2 dogs. No sweat off my back, though. After growing up in a small town in the Northeast, I was very eager to explore. My days after work were filled with long walks around the dog parks and exploring restaurants and craft breweries in downtown. All was well, until it wasn't. Being alone most of the time and raised in a town of 4,000 of my cousins, exaggeration, but not really. I was docile and trusting, the worst combination. About a month into being alone in the city, I would come home to 3 men smoking outside my door. The first encounter, I decided to keep on walking and called a friend nearby to help me get into my house safely. I thought this was a one-time thing, but weeks later, the men started to continually show up. It was routine even. When I got home at 5 p.m., they would be there lighting up a cigarette, almost like they were waiting for me. I was finally at my wit's end and asked them if they lived here and whether or not they could verify that with my landlord. None of them answered, and 2 proceeded to walk down the alley, but 1 remained stone cold and, standing his ground, continued to smoke. I was upset and repeated the question once more. "Do you live here? Can you verify this?" He stared at me with dark, cold eyes and put out his cigarette on my door, only to brush my shoulder as he left my property. It's safe to say I was unnerved. I reached out to my boyfriend to let him know what happened, and he relayed the message to our landlady. A few days had gone by since that last encounter, and there were no signs of the men since. I felt pretty good about myself. I had taken for granted being able to walk up my apartment steps without being fearful. I had made it to Friday and decided to treat myself to a few drinks with local friends. I had become very diligent about locking windows and doors. Being next to an alley made me feel extra vulnerable, and after my confrontation with the porch creeps, I was very on edge. My night out was very enjoyable, and after a few beers, I decided it was about time to go home. Thankfully, a friend of mine insisted on making sure I got into my house safely. After all, he was the one who had assisted me on a few occasions before. I arrived home and he walked me to my door, but upon arrival, my door was covered in ash and the floor in cigarette butts, with the aroma of freshly smoked cigs in the air. He could see the fear on my face and offered to sleep on the couch to keep watch, but I told him I would be fine on my own. I stayed up a bit longer, checking locks and pulling my blinds down. After about 20 minutes, I retreated to my bedroom, which faced my front door, while being sure to keep my door ajar so my Rhodesian Ridgeback could be aware of anything happening outside. After a bit of Netflix, I finally managed to doze off, until about 3 a.m. at least, when I awoke to my dog growling. I was petrified. Something in me knew tonight was the night they would be back. I got out of my bed slowly, trying to make as little sound as possible. I peered out my door and saw a single hand on the stained glass window and a pair of eyes peering in. Sure enough, he was back. I had unfortunately left my kitchen lamp on, exposing my inside house to the outside world, and I knew that if he saw me, it was game on. Slowly and quietly, I made my way to the lamp and turned it off so he could no longer see me, which ensued terror. The man, appearing to be shirtless and yelling slurs at me, began pounding on my door and demanding entrance. I retreated to my room and called 911, who told me to stay low, avoid interaction, and stay on the line until the officers arrived. I couldn't stand to watch him punching the window, because I knew it was a race between him and the officers for whoever got me first. Finally, there was a loud crash. I peered through the door crack to see that he had upgraded from a hand to a brick, causing the glass to begin cracking. I remember vividly. It had been almost 10 minutes on the phone with dispatch at this point, with officers 10 minutes away from home. After a few more brick throws, I watched him scale the porch to my window, and continuing to try and obliterate the glass, leaving cracks all across. But suddenly, there was silence. I once again looked toward my front door to see him looking back at me, cigarette in hand, until the cops arrived. I was told to wait for a knock on my door, which finally came to tell me it was safe to come out. I made it outside just as they were putting him in back of the vehicle when he yelled, "Bye, Pete." This shook me to my core. Only my family referred to me as that, and they were thousands of miles away. I realized he had been watching, listening, waiting. He probably knew my boyfriend was gone, and most likely heard me refuse to have my friend stay there. I watched the vehicle drive away, and called whoever I could get a hold of at this late hour. Come morning, my mom finally called me back, and told me to get in touch with officers and press charges, something that somehow had entirely slipped my mind during the mayhem. I called them back and asked them to get the paperwork, only to be told he was put in the hospital and ran off before properly identifying him. Needless to say, I moved shortly thereafter, and my boyfriend found another job locally. And to the cops who were absolutely no help, good riddance. And to the man who was after me for God knows what, let's never meet again. Hello, Redditors. Here's a story I've never told anyone, and partly because elements of the story are just not appropriate in most social situations. As a result, I've locked this away in my memory, and I very rarely think about it. Fair warning, this story does involve some sketchy sexual situations, but does not describe any actual sexual acts. Another disclaimer. I'm aware this story involves me being very stupid and careless. I'm not going to inject these acknowledgments into the story, but rest assured that in hindsight I'm aware of the foolishness that took place, and I don't need to be chided on that topic. Now, where to begin? The year was approximately 1998. I was a young gay man in my early 20s, living in a medium-sized city in the Midwestern US. This was sort of an in-between transitional time for gay people, where in most populous areas we had enough respect to live openly, but there were still plenty of people who did not like us. It was well before the invention of smartphones, and the internet was still in the early stages of mass adoption. There were large communities online, but it was not yet at the point where most Americans were online. Online socialization consisted mainly of chat rooms, hosted by various services like AOL, Yahoo, or IRC servers. Message boards were also still in use by large numbers of people. For gay men at that time, it it was nothing short of revolutionary. And prior to the internet and to the broader cultural changes, gay men had been stuck looking for fun in secretive or shady places due to the inability to freely express ourselves. In the 90s, it was still somewhat risky, but the internet offered a way to talk freely and anonymously without the risk of being ousted or worse. For this reason, it really took off in the gay communities, and gay men were a very large part of the user bases for these social platforms. It was suddenly very easy and relatively safe to find dates, friends, or just hook up, and it quickly became a norm for a lot of us. On the other hand, because it was such a new communication tool for almost everyone, we were almost completely blind to the risks. Being an attractive young man in my prime, I made liberal use of online communities to find dates. That is to say, I had plenty of hookups. My city had a decent number of chat rooms and personal message boards, and I had mostly great experiences. I met the typical assortment of good guys, closet cases, and weirdos that you'd expect. I wasn't an absolute hoe by most standards, but suffice to say that a cute gay at that time could generally have a lot more dates than your typical straight person. At some point during this time, I'd had some brief chat on a message board with a guy from my city. I forget his screen name. It's been over 20 years at this point. So let's call him Slim Guy 65. This back and forth had happened on a general thread in the gay section, not in private messages, so it was visible to anyone who chose to read through it. Nothing had come of it, but about a week later, I received an email from an unrecognized address. The email basically said, "Hey, I'm not gay and I don't really agree with the gay lifestyle. I'm here though because my friend met this Slim Guy 65 person from the message board, and the guy really hurt him. I don't want this to happen to anyone else. My friend tried to tell the police, but they wouldn't do anything. I see you were talking to that guy, so just be careful, okay? And stay away from him." Okay, that's strange. What does this person mean by really hurt him? Was his heart broken? Did he get beaten up or verbally abused or what? I responded to the email asking for clarification on what happened. I never received a response. I was slightly weirded out by it, but on the other hand, it was an anonymous email from someone who didn't respond and was completely vague about their warning. It could be anything. It could be some disgruntled ex trying to mess with the guy. It could be a real warning about someone gay bashing, but it could also be someone trolling who didn't have anything to do with anyone. I kept it in the back of my mind, but pretty much shrugged it off. Several weeks later, I had a weekday off work and decided to take to the internet to fish for some D, as was my custom. Lo and behold, I got an email response to a personal ad, and it was Slim Guy 65. He was offering to meet at his place to hang out and just have a good time. Wink wink, nudge nudge. I won't go into any details. As I recall, there weren't many in the first place discussed, other than the small talk and intros we'd done previously. Nothing about this guy was really sounding interesting to me, but I had no other offers on this day, so I decided why not. I'd go see what this dude was about. As I typed out my reply, I suddenly remembered that strange email I'd received warning me about this person. I went back and reread it, still vague, still presenting more questions and no answers. Should I take this anonymous warning at face value and just ignore this person? Well, I decided to go check him out anyway. His address was on a rather busy street, in the middle of a dense residential area, not some shack out in the woods. Plus, I could handle myself just fine. If he was weird, I could just get the fuck out of there. Before long, I arrived at the house at the agreed-upon time. It was a duplex-style house with one apartment on the ground floor and one on the second, part of a row of several identical kinds. It was the middle of the afternoon. There was plenty of traffic on the street, and the occasional person out on their porch or in their backyard. I pulled up to the driveway to the parking area behind the house, got out, and knocked on the door. The guy that answered was a pretty normal, kind of mousy-looking man, probably in his 40s. Slight, slim build, soft-spoken, It looked like any guy working in an office cubicle somewhere. Not really my type, but honestly my curiosity was piqued, and I had nothing better to do. So I stepped inside to take a look around and gauge the situation, with the warning email still fresh in my mind. I stepped into the back door into the kitchen. It was very clean, and there was nothing out on the counters. No tables or chairs or anything. That is to say, it didn't look like someone was living there. It had been kept up and cleaned but looked completely empty. Looking into the apartment, I could see that it was not set up as a living space. A large window with sliding glass was between the kitchen and living room, and I could see what looked like a large table out in the living room area. The man said something like, "Oh, this isn't where I live. A friend of mine used to run a doctor's office here. I maintain the building for him. It's private though. We have the place all to ourselves." Weird, but okay. He shut the back door and locked it, with a keyed deadbolt, the kind that you need a key to open even from the inside, and put the keys deep in his pockets. So, what do you want to do? At this point my danger sense spiked. This was not a normal home, and why was he immediately locking the door like that? It's not necessarily suspect. A lot of people have this sort of lock on their door, and the door has a window, so it even makes sense. Still, my gut was telling me something was not right here. I could tell, and now I was locked in. I asked him why he was locking it like that, which immediately flustered him. He started looking extremely nervous, and his voice wavered and halted. Not quite stuttering, but almost. We don't want someone to come in and interrupt us, right?" Flashing a weak, unconvincing smile. His demeanor and body language were all I needed to confirm this man was up to no good, or at least there was something he was hiding. However, I could tell that I was intimidating him. I was not a particularly muscular kid, but I did have a large frame. Even when I was at my very thinnest, I still had to wear size L tops and 36 waist pants, so I look very big, which people tend to interpret as me being stronger than I am. I'm also not a tough guy at all, but I do have that resting facial expression that makes me look like a thug. People who don't know me often assume I'm from a rough lifestyle or something. I sometimes use this to my advantage when I can, because before long a new acquaintance will eventually figure out that I'm a total wimp. But this was definitely an occasion to play up on the tough guy appearance, so I did exactly that. I put on my best steely face and told him to unlock the door, that I didn't want to be trapped in here. He looked for a moment like he was going to pee his pants. Then he said, "Okay, alright, I'll unlock it." He unlocked the deadbolt. "And I'll just lock this knob here." And he turned the little dial that locks the doorknob. That was fine with me, though. I continued to stare at him. "I'll just leave the keys on the counter here." He set his keys down near the sink. I was relatively satisfied now with that answer. At this point, though, my adrenaline was flowing. I was almost in full flight or fight mode, but I was kind of stuck in place. He was behind me in the door. I was freaked out, but this little weasel did not appear to pose any immediate physical threat to me. I could tell that his pants pockets were empty, and that I was intimidating the hell out of him. I didn't know yet exactly what to do, though. And keep in mind, despite my wordy descriptions, this all happened really quickly without any really long pauses. It had only been maybe 1 or 2 minutes since I had stepped in the door. This all happened at the pace of a conversation. "Well, let's go in." He was extremely nervous and trying not to appear so. He walked a wide path around me through the kitchen into what would normally be the living room, and toward the hall to the right from there. I was familiar with this floor layout. It was very common in apartments in this area. The hallway would lead into 2 small bedrooms, with a bathroom in between them. I hesitated, thinking I should just walk out that back door and take off. But really, now I was super curious. There was no way in hell I'm doing anything with this guy, but I wanted to see just what was going on here. I was also confident he couldn't take me if it came to a fight, so I slowly headed towards the living room. It felt like I was walking in slow motion. From the table entrance, I could see a large rectangular stainless steel table taking up a majority of the living room. I remember thinking this looked like a surgical table. It looked like it could rise and tilt, and had a recessed channel running all the way around the edge. In hindsight, I now know what that was. It was 100% a mortician's table. At that time, though, I thought it looked like a medical table of some sort. There was some other office-type cabinets and things around, I think, but now all I really remember is that table. The large front window looking out onto the street was covered by vertical blinds that were shut tight. SG65 said something like, "This used to be a doctor's office, like I said. Come on back here." The hallway revealed the room setup I had expected. The first bedroom door was closed. The second was open to a small, very clean bathroom. At the end of the hall was the other bedroom, which looked like, if the doctor's office story had been true, had at one time been converted to an exam room. "We can go in that room if you want. Go ahead and take a look." He stayed close by the other closed bedroom door. The back bedroom door was open, and I could see that the walls were covered in a honey-colored wood paneling, the type you might see in a den or office that hadn't been updated since the early 1970s. I took a few steps down to that door, trying to be very aware of what he was doing behind me. He didn't budge, though. When I got to that room, the first thing I noticed was that the door had a keyed deadbolt lock just like the back door. This room locked from the outside, though. I wondered if there was a lever on the inside, but I pretty much knew the answer to that question without needing to look. I also saw a chair, a non-swiveling, plastic desk chair with thin metal legs, sitting right in the center of the room. The room had old dark carpet and those wood-paneled walls. I noticed that the walls were completely paneled over with no windows, and I know that room had at least one, probably two, so whoever had done the paneling had covered them over. There was also a phone in there, plugged in and sitting on the floor. It was an old office phone, probably from the 80s or 90s. Just sitting on the carpet near the wall with the chair at a slight distance facing the phone. There was nothing else in that room. I was standing in the threshold of that room with one foot slightly in, absolutely not going past that door. I looked back at the man. He was still standing by the other door, just nervously smiling at me, trying hard to look casual, but obviously very nervous. "Well, what do you want to do?" Instead of answering, I felt around the back side of the deadbolt lock. Sure enough, nothing there but smooth wood on the door. It also dawned on me that I didn't see a light switch anywhere for the ceiling lamp. So where was it? Who knows? It should have been just inside the door, of course, but that original switch had been covered up by the paneling. He mumbled something about not having a key to that lock, and don't worry about it. I turned back to face the man and said, "What is it you want to do here?" My skin had gone ice cold as I realized I was way too far into this apartment. I was running through my options in my head. What is this guy going to do? He doesn't appear to have any weapon or anything in reach, but who the fuck knows what goes on in this place? He was almost completely derailed by that question. He stammered out, "Some hot man-to-man fun?" With the weakest smile I've ever seen, looking like he was a hair's breadth away from panicking. That sounds comical, but really that sentence was probably the most chilling part of the experience for me. It was the way he said it, like he had to come up with something on the fly, something that would sound plausible, and he failed. Who says that in real life? "Hey, do you want to have some hot man-to-man fun?" Nobody. That's something you'd see on a cheesy advertisement for a porn site. That was it. I said, "No, I want to go. I'm leaving." I quickly walked past him as he flattened himself against the wall to avoid me, and I noped right through the living room dissection area and through the kitchen to the back door, which was thankfully still not deadbolted. The keys were still on the counter. I let myself out the door and didn't bother closing it as I saw him slowly coming out from behind me. I deliberately walked, not ran to my car. And looking back to the building, I could see that indeed there was a window facing the backyard area from that paneled room, but it had been completely sealed up. The dude was shutting and locking the back door. And I left, heart pounding, skin icy cold, thinking, holy fuck, what was that? Was this guy some kind of killer? Some awkward, closeted gay guy with access to sterile-looking apartments with an autopsy table? A windowless room that locks from the outside, with a chair, phone, and no light switch. It was clear to me that the poor soul who walked in gets locked in, and he probably shut off the light from somewhere and called the phone. Other than that, it was anyone's guess what happened. I assume the friend of the judgmental person who emailed me must have been some kid that got locked in for whatever game ensues. Driving home, at first I thought of course I have to call the police and tell them what's in that place. But thinking it through, I realized I didn't really have a crime to tell them about. I went to meet a man for casual sex, and what? He had a room with a chair in it? He had, as I thought at the time, an exam table? The police aren't going to do anything with that story. The guy didn't touch me or do anything to me. He even let me leave. I considered calling an anonymous tip line, but again, what exactly was there to report? There was no actionable crime. Also, keep in mind at the time that while the local police in this city were pretty decent, they weren't especially interested in getting involved with and helping the gays. They'd prosecute actual crimes if it was cut and dry, but I'd heard plenty of times of them not choosing to follow up on cases where there was not an easy arrest to be made. I decided to not report anything, because nothing would come except drawing unwanted attention to myself. Even in retrospect, I think that was probably the most rational choice to make. If this happened in 2020 today, law enforcement would be on it like that. But back then, not so much. Live and learn, I guess. I still drove past that house once in a while, in the normal course of life for several years. I'd pay attention to how it looked. The vertical blinds were closed for maybe 5 or 6 years whenever I went past. Eventually, the blinds were down, and there were decorative curtains in the window. I assumed the place was sold to someone who actually lived in it. Around 2002, maybe 2003, there was a murder of a young man in the news. He'd been found in the next state, which borders my city, so it's not far away. I recognized him from the gay community, but I hadn't known him personally. A friend mentioned to me something about the local serial killer. I said, "What?" He explained that a few young men had gone missing over the past year, each after being at one specific dive bar, and each being found several miles to the north past the state line, out in the country. The case on the news matched up with that MO. My friend told me the young guy had been at that bar and had left with someone that night that he disappeared. The news report didn't mention anything about a gay bar or similar recent cases, of course. I had to wonder if my acquaintance from the internet had anything to do with it. The location of the murders apparently was nowhere near that duplex, at least according to the story I was told. I never heard of a resolution on the news either, or any official mention of a suspected serial killer, just some idle gossip.